We're sitting here today with Anthony Dworkin. He's a fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he's our good and great expert on multilateralism. And he's been working on these from a long time ago. I remember that one of the first pieces of work that we launched at, when we launched ECFR was precisely on the status of multilateralism and the role of Europe in multilateralism. And already there, 1 decade ago, he found out that Europeans were increasingly losing weight in the multilateral organizations and the UN, and that fewer and fewer countries were voting with Europe, and that multilateralism in that way was being eroded by great powers being able to gather around like-minded countries, and the EU not being able to put traction. And so, hello, Anthony. It's nice to have you here.
Hello. Thanks for giving me the chance to speak to you. It's a timely subject.
Yeah, as we record this, the UN General Assembly is having his first virtual gathering. It's the 75th edition, but this time, because of the pandemic, is being done. I don't know whether in Zoom or which platform, but I know there is a virtual meeting. Does it say also, that is quite telling of the status of the world today and what the pandemic has done to multilateralism? So I wanted to ask you, what is the health of the UN General Assembly, but also the overall situation of multilateralism as we speak and the UNGA meets?
Yeah, well, Nacho, like you say, the fact that what was supposed to be this great celebration for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the General Assembly, all the leaders coming together to mark this moment, the fact that this is all happening remotely is kind of, it's sort of so easy for this to be a metaphor of the state of multilateralism, because in the same way as the pandemic has stopped the leaders from traveling, and I guess one benefit is at least they don't have to listen to each other's speeches and sit there in the assembly hall for all those days. But in that same way, I think we can see that the pandemic has both put a spotlight on the problems that the multilateral system faces at the moment, and if anything, made them worse. And, a pandemic that affects everyone, it kind of could be the moment that the world pulls together, to fight a common enemy. But it hasn't quite worked out like that. And what we've seen is the problems of the multilateral system, I think, just being highlighted. So it's a difficult moment, and it's, there are a very number of different problems that we can discuss, but I think the central issue is just that this is a world where a lot of the great powers now see the kind of interactions and interdependencies of the world as a forum for competition rather than as a call to collaboration. And so if you look across the spectrum, whether it's the Security Council, whether it's health, whether it's trade, you see many of the great powers kind of fighting it out in the multilateral system rather than looking for common ground. And that's, that I think is one problem. And then I guess linked to that is another problem. We'd like to think that the multilateral system is the embodiment of some sort of liberal order of the world, the rules-based with these ideals of human rights and so on. But it's hard to have a multilateral system and a liberal order when a lot of countries in the world are no longer liberal and don't really want to play by the rules.
We will discuss this, what this means in terms of what the implications for these are for Europe. But first, I wanted to to discuss, the management of the pandemic by the multilateral system, because back in 2008, 2010, when the economic financial crisis, even if we know that the economy is very divisive and that the US and China have completely different economic systems, and the world has, different visions of economic policy, but still there was multilateralism, there was the G20, there was kind of a coordinated effort to tackle the consequences or to deal with the financial crisis. Now the paradox is that, a pandemic is something which, is very technical, should be led by experts, it's health, it's non-divisive and probably non-divisible as we see in the impact. And yet we haven't seen multilateral organizations being able to deal with it, neither from the security nor the economic. Of course, health. The WHO has been in the spotlight for being captured or not by China. What is what this reveals, and why do you think this pandemic hasn't been able to be managed properly by these organizations? Who's the culprit, and who should be held accountable for this lack of governance of the pandemic?
Well, I think there's probably quite a lot of blame to go around in this case, I think. And when you talk about the international system today, the kind of overwhelming fact is the fact of US-China rivalry, right? You have these two great powers, China a lot more powerful and a lot more kind of forceful on the world stage now than it was 12 years ago. As though it's pursuing a bit more its own path. And against that, you have the United States, which has always had a kind of slightly complicated relationship to playing by the rules, but under President Trump, has really kind of turned its back on multilateral cooperation in favor of an approach that seems to be based on the idea that the US is the biggest and it'll do best in bilateral relations. So you have those two facing off against each other. And then I think you have a lack of international leadership. So the G20 has kind of been missing in action, partly because the US and China are squabbling over, how to assign blame for the pandemic and the impact that it's had, and partly because some of the other countries in the world haven't really stepped up to fill that gap. And the EU has made some efforts and is trying, and we'll maybe talk about that in a minute. But it's kind of hard when the two big economic powers aren't really ready to play along. And the World Health Organization, I think, is really a perfect example of that. It's there's been quite a lot of criticism of the World Health Organization, but it's really, as with many multilateral organizations, it's kind of dependent on the support of its member states. And, it doesn't have the tools to compel a country to provide information in a timely way or to hold countries accountable, because countries haven't given it that power. They don't want it to be that powerful. And so at the beginning, there was, some kind of correct criticism, I think, about the speed with which China released information and the kind of transparency with which it was, owning up to what was happening in its country. And pandemics are very politically sensitive because they have an enormous impact on your economy. And what I think we've also seen during this pandemic is the way that global health is a kind of, it's a kind of proxy for countries' international reputations and international standing. So, who has the blame is a political issue. Who's going to develop the vaccine is a political issue. And in this competitive political environment, what we've seen is the World Health Organization becoming kind of a political football. And you see that with the United States now, turning its back on the organization, which it says is controlled by China. And you would have thought this isn't the best moment to pull out of the World Health Organization if you're the number one funder, but that's what the United States seems to be doing.
And on the U.S. and China, there is sometimes this this discussion that the U.S. is very openly and very forcefully and sometimes even very brutally undermining multilateral institutions by just withdrawing the financial resources, and this comes from either refugees to migration, to whichever issues like the WTO. But also undermining their rules, and the U.S. does kind of very openly and very aggressively. But then and then China appears sometimes as a country which is in favor and which is the true holder of multilateral values because it is investing or is in the organizations and so on, right? So are these kind of these different attitudes towards multilateralism hiding that at the end both want to kind of control it in different ways? Maybe the Chinese are smarter, but maybe not necessarily align with the ideas of a rules-based functioning of international organizations.
I think that's absolutely right. And, you know, not surprisingly, if the United States' response to this kind of competition across the world and across international organizations is to step back, what you see is, you know, is the other power, China, stepping forward and becoming more active and more influential and trying to present itself as the kind of, you know, the one that believes in multilateralism. But it's, you know, it's a little bit multilateralism with Chinese characteristics. And this isn't necessarily the view of multilateralism that we in Europe would necessarily want to share. So if you look at what China has been doing in the Human Rights Council, you know, it's been pushing a series of resolutions with some success that are trying to sort of slightly reshape the way that human rights are discussed, you know, towards what they call kind of win-win collaboration, and away from the idea of countries kind of holding other countries to account or shining a spotlight in a critical way on other countries. Whereas I think we would see that kind of accountability and scrutiny as an essential part of the international human rights system. So, and, you know, China is, not surprisingly, is a little bit selective about which parts of the multilateral rules-based system it wants to observe. So, you know, it's rejected rulings when it comes to the application of the Neo Convention on the Law of the Sea and the South China Sea. You know, so there's a little bit of slight kind of selectivity there, and also trying to, you know, as I say, slightly reshape or kind of remake the norms that are guiding the international system. And I think as we, you know, increasingly come to focus on new areas in multilateralism, like the digital realm, something you probably know about more than me, you know, I think there would be a lot of unease if we think that China is going to be the dominant player, kind of setting the international norms in that area.
Yeah. So yeah, this paradox you noted almost a decade ago that if Saudi Arabia or Venezuela end up chairing the Human Rights Committee, there is something wrong with multilateralism, right? And you know, what is the role then for the EU to try and keep this system working and alive? And as we've discussed on various occasions, this is this paradox that Europe is doing two things at the same time, which may sound contradictory or could be put to contradiction. On the one hand, it's saying multilateralism is our DNA. We want to be the front runners. We want to keep it alive. On the other hand, Josep Borrell, the High Representative, is saying Europe has to learn to the language of power. Others are weaponizing international institutions and all these arrangements from trade, investment, migration. So Europe has to learn to play dirty like the others do, and sometimes act unilaterally, either by, you know, regulating on its own or by imposing sanction, by fixing its own standards. You know, how do you see this kind of contradiction between I want to play clean, but if others play dirty, I need to be able to play dirty as well?
Right, right. Yeah, it's tough to it's a complicated business to use the language of power to support a system of rules. But that's where the European Union is now, and it's difficult to be if you are the only multilateralist, then the multilateral system is not working, and so there's a delicate balancing act, I think, for Europe at this point, because it would like to sustain a rules-based system, and one that is based around a particular set of liberal values, not the Chinese characteristics that I was speaking about. And yet, you also want to have a multilateral system that takes in the powerful countries of the world, and as many countries of the world as possible. Because if you're talking about climate change, or you're talking about global health, or you're talking about the world trade, you want to extend your reach as far as possible, because otherwise you're going to be missing out part of the picture. And so that's the complication. On the one hand, to try and be inclusive as far as possible, but that means including countries that maybe are not so supportive of your values, or even of a rules-based approach. And so you can see Europe is trying to kind of thread its way through this challenge at the moment, and it's trying to, I think, as you say, use the language of power a little bit more, but to do it, with the ultimate goal of kind of building a wider coalition behind this kind of rules-based approach. And how's that going to work out? Well, I don't know. There, some kind of political decisions coming up in the next couple of months that will have an impact. Here I'm referring to the election that is not far away in the United States. And if the US elects Joe Biden as its president, you'll see the United States swinging back a little bit more towards a position that's closer to Europe in terms of support for international institutions. If not, then Europe will be in a bit more of a lonely position. But, the position of the United States is not the only question. And I think what Europe is trying to do is to operate on several different tracks at once. And I think in some areas, the multilateral system will have to be a little bit of a two-track system. So you'll have one kind of set of rules and procedures that's for everyone. That'll be the World Trade Organization, with its kind of trying to include all the countries that are active in international trade, or the World Health Organization. And these organizations, I think, will continue to be slightly limited by the fact that they're accommodating a lot of different value systems. I think it's going to be tough to get China to reform its economy, to turn it into something that's, that doesn't involve state subsidies and so on and so forth. So, I think we'll have to accept a degree of diversity. I think we'll have to accept a degree of diversity in security affairs. How do you settle a conflict like Syria? On what terms? The Russians are going to have a view on that. So I think that'll be one element. And within that system, I think the role for Europe is just to kind of fight the good fight and keep trying to win supporters. Going back to this ECFR project you discussed, to build the coalition that believes in human rights at the United Nations, to try and win supporters for a certain view of how the digital world is going to be regulated. So there's a kind of battle of ideas within that system, but also some give and take. And then I think the other thing that we're seeing is kind of alongside that, a bit more of a kind of club approach, a club of the, like-minded countries that are sort of signing more advanced trade deals between themselves that include standards on, environmental standards or standards on workers' rights. I think we may see this in the climate realm, where if the EU goes ahead with some sort of carbon tax, you'll see an attempt to sort of set standards within Europe and then hopefully expand them to other countries using Europe's power, which is more economic and trade power than military power, to try and win that over. You could see the International Criminal Court as a kind of club for justice, where countries sign up and then are subject to greater scrutiny. So I think that's the kind of maybe the model we're moving towards a little bit. On the one hand, within the more wider system, trying to push a certain set of values, but with some compromise and opportunism involved. And then on a slightly separate track, trying to build out a sort of concentric circles around Europe of countries that subscribe to a bit more of a kind of European view of how things should work.
Yeah, no, that's quite interesting, because as you say, if at the end the international system reflects the values and other constituent members, and these values which are not anymore dominant in terms of democracy and liberal values and human rights, not even in the US itself, sometimes, so there is kind of a poisoning of the multilateral sphere. And do you see, and so then, as you say, do you see then that the future of multilateralism is more kind of an islands of multilateralism or mini-lateralism, from which you are conquering or trying to build coalitions or link to each other? So it's kind of a patchwork of places. It's a multilateral system with lots of holes. So to go from A to B, you may have to go all the way around, because there is no direct communication. That looks like a kind of a very shaky and unpredictable world for the EU to try and manage, right?
I think it's going to be a more complicated world. I guess I would see it as, maybe a kind of underlying, because I think, I guess I'm enough of a liberal myself at heart to think that cooperation is ultimately in the best interest of the wide range of countries in the world. Cooperation on health, cooperation on climate. So I think there will be a kind of, some in cooperation to limit the use of force. So on those areas, I think there will be sort of some, maybe more minimal international multilateral system will survive. And, there'll be continuing efforts in areas like development, cooperation, and so on, where I think the UN will continue to be an important player, with the series of development goals, the MDGs and the SDGs, sustainable development. I think those kinds of efforts will carry on probably in quite a wide area, but in other respects, the kind of wider multilateral system, I think countries will still be trading with each other even where they disagree. I don't think that the economies of Europe and the United States are going to decouple from the Chinese economy. I think they'll continue to be a mutual advantage in trade, but it'll be carried on with a certain degree of wariness and suspicion when it comes to anything which could have a security component, and particularly digital components, digital security aspects. So I think it'll be a kind of basic system, and then some islands of more kind of advanced, as we might like to see it, or more liberal, multilateralism, with these kind of plurilateral trade deals. And it's in a way it's a little bit like going back to the situation in the Cold War, where you had one sort of set of institutions that covered the world, and another with the West. But the difference is that we're much more intertwined now than we were then, and so there are many more connections. Global health issues are much more pressing. Economic interdependency is much greater. And therefore, I think the relations between the kind of thinner international order and the more kind of substantial kind of liberal world, there are going to be a lot more interconnections and a lot more political complications to come around them, I think.
That's funny because for most of the Cold War, there was a lot of multilateral cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union with binding agreements on a number of issues related with disarmament and so on. We tend to forget that there was a lot of cooperation, even on embodiment and rules and so on. But so last question to conclude. I'm still a bit far away from being 75, but I'm now old enough to have forgotten times when we were not discussing UN reform. So it's kind of now impossible to go back to those times. Like UN reform is always on the table, but my fear is that I will be 75 and UN reform will be on the table, maybe because it's not, because it's a good idea that cannot be delivered. So we should kind of maybe stop thinking that just because it is a good idea, it should happen. Maybe it's a good idea and it won't happen. Should we kind of quit and not to go to any more seminars on UN reform, or are you still optimistic and you see yourself at 75 still going to those seminars?
I try not to go to too many seminars on UN reform now. And I think it's a pretty safe bet that when the UN gets to be 100, the discussion over UN reform will still be a very lively one. And yes, as time goes by, the setup of the UN looks increasingly anomalous and obsolete. And paper I wrote with my colleague Richard Gowan, we said that the UN, the multilateral system, had 3 crises. And one was a crisis of power, one was a crisis of relevance, and one was a crisis of legitimacy. And that crisis of legitimacy is not going to get any better as economic changes happen across the world. But we all know what the problem is, and the problem is that the reform has to have the support of the countries that are currently in the most advantageous position. And strangely, they seem a little reluctant to give up that position of supremacy. So maybe the system will evolve, but I think it may look, more similar than we'd like to think, even in another 25 years.
Okay, let's not wait 25 years to do our next conversation on multilateralism. It was a pleasure to have you on, as usual, and thanks for your sustained work on this issue, which I think is crucial. And I'm sure everyone would be, quite happy to see this discussion and participate in this conversation. Thanks for this, Anthony.
Thanks, Nacho. Thanks for the very interesting conversation.